Hello and welcome back to Climbing on Mount Sophia. I'm very excited today to be joined by Cory Kodel. Cory and I met, as many of you may know, there was a conference in Chino, California about a week ago, as of this recording, with Paul Vanderklay, John Vervaeke, and Jonathan Pageau. The theme of the conference was the quest for a spiritual home. And I met many wonderful folks at that conference and had some really just incredible conversations. And um, there was a kind of an optional event prior to the conference that was paintballing, paintball for Jesus. It's kind of like a, I don't know, maybe it's something of a low level sacrament as a shout out to Grim Grizz here. Um, but I was kind of riffing on an insight that was coming to me while several of us were standing around drinking water in between rounds of paintball, and the insight had to do with the problem of embodiment and the particular type of embodiment and flow that I was experiencing as a part of being in this you know conflict slash simulated conflict sort of situation of paintball. And I found myself engaging in what I think was really genuine dialogos with Cory, who I came to find out has a much more thorough and embodied engagement with this kind of question of what is it? How is it that we might find our deepest embodiment in things like conflict and in the military, and especially in a modern world where many of us are kind of missing a sense of embodiment. It seems that was part of the theme that came out of the conference, and I would argue is a deep part of the meaning crisis as such. And how is it that we might actually be maintaining our embodiment in the modern world through specifically our conflict and our training for conflict. And so that's kind of the background. And so Cory, welcome. And if you want to like to introduce yourself a little bit, and then we can see where we go.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ken. And thank you for inviting me to do this. I have to say uh, it was very gratifying, and it was kind of funny too. I almost felt bad about it when I first met you there at the little water cooler at the paintball field. We just started talking completely, organically. I did not recognize you. I have to confess. I've seen a couple of things that you do, and I had even just watched your second interview with John Vervaeke and DC Schindler, which was incredible. And even then, it just didn't click with me, and I'm almost glad that I didn't recognize you because because it was just like, oh, this guy Ken, he seems really cool. And then I realized afterwards, like, wait, I've seen him before. He's one of the like minor celebrities at this event. And I probably would have, engaged in a less organic manner. So I hope it wasn't like an affront to you or anything that I didn't recognize you initially. But
No, that's actually just. I'll let you keep going, but as a side comment, that was a very strange experience to find that many people addressed me knowing more about me than I did about them. And so certainly not a problem. And like you said, if it allowed for a more clear engagement, that's wonderful. So
yeah, and then when you offered to continue the conversation too, I was very excited because I think that we were touching on some genuine dialogos there, and I was very excited to hear what you have to say, especially so it just for the context, I'm in the military. Um, for the context of what we're going to talk about, I'll just throw out there that I'm a military pilot. I'm in the U.S. Marine Corps, and I'm going to be an instructor pilot right now at the in flight school. That's the job that I'm transitioning to right now. Um, and so it kind of came up just in the context of paintball that, like you said, there's an element of embodiment that has to do with uh, the competition or the mutual suffering between brothers and between mutual combatants, so to speak. And this is stuff that I've thought about. I've never been in direct combat either, so I also have to throw that out there as a caveat to anything that I say. I'm by no means an expert. I've thought a lot about stuff, but I've my experience is still relatively limited. So I make no claims to expertise of any kind. Um,
Well, good, because
but
I don't either. I don't either. That's that's the nature of climbing Mount Sophia. Is there's no claims to anything. It's that it allows for a little bit more freedom of exploration. But in that, so I one of the comments that you had made when we were talking was that for you, flying has been a really clear um, practice to engender flow state. And maybe I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that because I thought that was really wonderful.
yeah, yeah, totally. I love doing things with my body. I always have. I started very early with piano lessons, and so music was always a big. That was probably my initial like training in kind of a hand-eye coordination, turning stuff up here into stuff with my hands in kind of a more disciplined way. And I've always had an interest in flying from the time that I was very young. When I first got to do it after I joined the military, it was different from what I expected, but in another sense, it was exactly what I expected. Like the thing that I love about flying, and I think this might have been something akin to what I said to you before, is it's one of the most holistically embodying experiences that I think
Hmm.
you probably could experience because you start by studying books. It's all propositional, it's all up here. You start by rote memorization, learning how systems work. So you have to have a little bit of mechanical knowledge of the physics involved. And then you think about what you're going to do when you actually get into this machine, because when you're actually sitting in it, it's very, very, very different from when you're, just thinking about it or just reading. But there's actually a practice that they teach in flight school called chair flying, where you read
Hmm.
the books and you study the procedures and you actually sit in a chair before you ever go flying and you close your eyes and you rehearse in your mind step by step and visualize what you're going to do. And I think professional athletes will often do something very similar to help start making that transition from the propositional to the embodied participatory type of knowing.
Yeah.
And then when you actually fly, it's it's absolutely, once you get good at it, there's very much a flow state aspect to it because things that start out very difficult and very complex to do, you have to think really hard about doing it. It starts to get parts of it become more natural, more automated. But things are always coming at you. You're always trying to build your situational awareness of what's going on around you. And so every time something new comes in and you react to it, you can definitely find easy comparisons to something like playing music or something like sparring in martial arts, where things are happening and you're responding, and it gets in. And the fact that you're flying is, contextually, there's something special about that I'd have to think about how to put that into terms properly. But it's and then when you fly with other people as well, it's like dimensions of this just go higher and higher. It's a very holistic, full mind body experience.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I noticed that was coming up for me as you were talking about that was that there's a very clear articulation and picture of what I think education is, properly speaking, where the four P's of knowing, right? The propositional gives way to the procedural, which gives way to the perspectival, which ultimately gives way to the participatory. But in how you're talking about it, especially once it comes to actually flying, and then especially if you're going to fly with other people, you have to have it become properly symbolic. So it's not as if the propositions go away, but you don't see them anymore. It's not as if the procedures go away, but I'm guessing you probably don't even really see those anymore, right? You don't think about what your hand's doing or which which thing, you know, which, I'm guessing that 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 kind of specific thinking of making sure that you're doing it correctly goes away a little bit because you've done it enough times that you're just in it and it's happening. And it's cool that I mean, yeah, that's, you're also if you're flying and you're flying a plane, especially if it's something like a fighter pilot, like something that has real performance, uh, um, like a fighter jet, I mean, then I would imagine that obviously you have a lot. There's a lot more to lose, certainly, but there's also, I mean, goodness, like you can do things that a human being like shouldn't be able to do, obviously, right? Like, um, not shouldn't in the moral sense, but like,
No, but I
our
know what you mean.
the
Yeah,
capabilities are insane.
yeah, there's a sense of, I don't know. It's like a too fancy of a word to use, but transcendence about it. It's like it is something that is unnatural for a human being, and yet it's something that human beings have dreamt about since, you know, recorded history. You find very, very early accounts of people reflecting on the birds and wanting to partake in that
Yeah.
style
And
of existing.
I have a question about kind of an identity thing. So one of the
Hmm.
things that John will talk about the research with the Mars rover and the people
Yeah,
driving the Mars rover is kind of, starting to identify themselves with the machine. And Jordan Hall uses the example of the identity you'll have with your car. When somebody runs into you, you don't say they hit my car, you say they hit me, right?
right. Yeah.
And how you can actually embody, especially machines that you're operating. So I'm wondering, like, what that's like for you with the jet you're flying, and what jet do you fly?
Yeah. Yeah. So I fly V-22 Ospreys. So
Okay,
that's the crazy one that takes off like a helicopter and it flies like an airplane.
that's awesome.
Yeah, when you say performance is right. Like, oh my goodness, it's such a cool platform. You can do all the cool things that a helicopter can do, or at least some of them, and a lot of the same things that a fixed wing platform can do. It's very neat. But yeah, what you're talking about is very much a real thing. Um, it becomes an extension of me when I'm actually on the controls and I'm actually flying. Like you don't my own body kind of becomes transparent to myself, in exactly the way that Dr. Vervaeke describes in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. You know, like when you're using your pen to tap something versus feeling your fingers versus becoming aware of the cup itself that you're tapping. It's very much the same sort of thing. And you're constantly going in and out as well because you have to be very, very focused on what's going on in the cockpit, managing systems and communications and so forth. And then you have to be thinking about actually flying the aircraft, you know, going where you want to be going, making sure that you're staying within the limits, and all of that, at the right altitude, holding the right heading. And then with military flying, especially because you're always flying in a mission that has a larger nested context, you're
Mm.
also paying attention of what's going on with the mission, which means you're listening to the radio because you can't see it like physically. You're paying attention to keep track of where all the other players are and where the enemy might be, and trying to predict what's going to come next because you're in a constant decision making cycle as well. So it's the in and out aspect where you're focusing in on a small thing and then focusing out on the big thing and doing all of that at once, and then delegating to other people to try to, the extended cognition works that way as well. As an aircraft commander, if you've got crew members that you're working with, you're making sure that they're taking on some of that cognitive load for you. If you're being effective, then if you try to do it all by yourself, you're not going to be able to do it. You become ineffective immediately. So it's, yeah, all of that's there.
And that's just again, like, man, there's such a tremendous exemplification of the symbolic in that, right? Now, so you could argue about what level of symbology that is and how it stacks up and all those kinds of things, but just in an operational and kind of straightforward sense, like the notion of parts maintaining their particularity but coming together into a whole larger than themselves in a nested fractal pattern is like very, like, that seems to be very much, I imagine that when you were encountering some of the notions of John Vervaeke and Jonathan Pageau, that um, there were some real fireworks for you with that kind of experience in your own life.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It's when they start talking about things like collective consciousness or, collective intelligence, it's very easy for me to start making connections to things that I've experienced. Because again, when you are, especially if you're an aircraft commander and you're flying an aircraft and there's, a few other people on that plane with you who are subordinate to you, which brings in the question of authority too, which is a whole nother topic that, maybe we'll dive into another time. They're literally, their lives depend on the decisions that I'm going to make.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, and yet you become very tight with the people that you fly with, but they're constantly feeding me information. I'm feeding them information. I'm trying to maintain the big picture, but it's all, you almost operate as a single organism in a very real sense. And so and you experience similar things, it's not unique to that by any means. It's been true in my family. It's been true in, in my church life as well, and just communities in general. It's not difficult for me to see how there's something that's very real about collective consciousness.
Yeah. Okay, so this has been really good. I feel like I've gotten a sense of what it feels like for you to fly a plane, a little bit of a sense. Obviously not complete, but you've obviously attained some level of mastery of this. I know you're not going to claim that by any means, but enough that you're being trusted by people much higher than you in the hierarchy to train others to do this as well. So that's really significant. So. You like I don't get the sense from you that this is just kind of like an incidental thing you're doing for other purposes. Like this really means something to you. Like you this feels like meaningful for its own sake in a sense to you. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, you are right. However, I would add on to that. It is something that I've always wanted to do. It's something that I'm very personally passionate about, but it's
Yeah,
all nested in higher purposes for me as well. And it's that, I don't want to go into my whole entire life story, but that's a big part of the story of how I joined the military, because initially I did want to join just because I wanted to do cool stuff like that, and also
yeah,
be looking for that, even that kind of community.
yeah,
Um, but I kind of took a path where I decided that it wasn't for me, and then I came back and realized that it was what I was meant to do. But now the reason that all of that was still there. Like I still wanted all of those things, but
yeah,
the reason that I did it was for a greater nested purpose.
yeah, yeah,
Because of it. Yeah, we can talk about that some other time, maybe though. But
yeah,
it's all, even though that's what I love doing, it's very much subordinated to many other things in my life.
yeah. Okay, so if you're all right with it, let's pivot a little bit to talk about this question of. So I'll lay out the problem a little bit. To me, it seems that there's a problem where, on a philosophical level, we are disconnected from reality in the modern and postmodern worlds. There are specific reasons for that, or specific pathways of understanding that. Maybe one that's been particularly impactful for me is the notion of freedom. I would point specifically to DC Schindler's book "Freedom from Reality" as being one of the most helpful for me to understand. But essentially, it's that this idea or notion of freedom that we all kind of glorify, that we perceive as a good in itself, is something like the drive for instrumentality and just power as such, and that pursuing that as the good is in fact actually kind of fundamentally diabolical in the sense of to be separate from. And the reason the book is called Freedom from Reality is that it's actually extracting us further and further and further out of reality. So that's the philosophical front. In an economic front, I think the capitalist framework tends to fall right lock and step with that, and the emphasis on consuming, that there's a sort of a black hole of consumption that can never be filled, and more things can come in, and I'm simply using up reality to kind of satisfy some kind of desires. And I think that is deeply plays a deep role in a kind of disembodied disconnection from reality that we kind of experience culturally. So philosophically, that's culturally, and then in what I would term kind of mainstream little c Christianity, especially the type that I grew up in and that I was in for a while with evangelical Christianity, tends to really emphasize a two worlds mythology, and at least in my experience, had a very much of an escapist kind of, let's this world doesn't matter. Let's just get to heaven. It's all about just getting out of here to get to heaven, kind of thing. And so, to the degree that I think there's some legitimacy in the idea that even secular atheists are simply a sect of Christianity in that kind of way, because I think they kind of believe all those suppositions actually as well. To not go into that and characterize all that, I'm just going to assert those things in order to say that we have a very, very significant problem, that we are disembodied, and we are disconnected from reality, and we are in fact attempting to make that more so. We are particularly continuing to exacerbate that in our broader society and Western culture. So that's the problem that I'm posing. And so I'm curious to hear from you how your experience in the military, and maybe even more broadly militaries as such, play a role in embedding us back into our bodies, embedding us back into reality, and forcing us to become embodied.
Sure. Yeah, and that's a lot of I've never heard it put quite in the context that you just used, so that was useful. I'm going to be thinking about that for a little bit. Um, and it's one thing that, or I guess a couple of things that I'd want to help with the context there. When we're talking about freedom here, I want to emphasize that it's not the political version of that, right? Like it's not like, you know, America freedom, that kind of freedom, because I think most people that I know would immediately make that assumption that that's what you're talking about. But what I think you're talking about is freedom in the sense of, in the philosophical, individual person kind of sense. If you want to maximize freedom as like a basic value, and in so doing, you run the risk of eliminating restraints or constraints that actually afford you the ability to do things,
Yeah,
to where
yeah,
you're talking about the freedom becomes dangerous in the sense of, well, if you wanted maximum freedom to move up and down and left and right and whatever else, plop me in the middle of the ocean, say, here, you're
right,
maximally free,
right, right,
and I will die very
right,
quickly
right.
if I'm by myself floating in the ocean. So
Yeah,
does that sound
that's
like a
help.
fair characterization?
Yeah, that's helpful context. Yes, I do not mean, and the particular distinction I would make is it's not about freedom in the sense of that freedom is not a good thing. It's the answer to the question of, well, what do you mean by freedom? And
Yes, yes.
what I'm specifically arguing would be that the notion of freedom as increased options and decreased constraints
As
is
such.
actually, yeah, is actually a really is diabolical. So that would
Yeah.
be, yeah. All right.
Great.
Thank
Yeah.
you for that.
So, and yeah, yeah, yeah. So, and without going into economics or religion too deeply, because I don't even want to go into that
Yeah.
too much here. But
Yeah. Those are just kind of broad strokes. Like,
within a military context, and again, this is my own personal opinion. I'm not speaking for anybody here. These are just my own reflections from my own experience. Um, I resonate very deeply with what you say. I believe that there is a crisis in the way that you're describing it. Another way that I would draw it out is by looking at how technology affords us the ability to kind of leave reality behind in a very profound kind of way. We have virtual realities that we can make, whatever kind of reality we want. And we have a tendency, it seems like, to prefer it rather than actual embodied reality more and more culturally. That's just another piece I would append onto that. One of the things to me, and it's so cool how this came up in your most recent video with DC Schindler and Dr. Vervaeke, the the importance of those mundane necessities. I think it Eric Pearl, the guy who quoted that the most philosophical thing you can do is change a diaper. I
yes. Yeah.
resonate with that so deeply that and that ties in directly to the sense of suffering again,
Mm,
and in the sense of combat as well. Because if you're talking about trying to anchor yourself to reality, if that's what you want to accomplish, I think the best way that you can do that is to, one way you could describe it is take on responsibilities. Um,
mm,
People who live very close to the kind of reality where if you don't do something, there are severe consequences for it
mm,
in terms of suffering or death. If you're somebody who lives, on the edge of poverty and maybe you're a subsistence farmer, if you don't go out and plant and sow and reap at the appropriate times, like your family could die.
yeah.
You don't have much space for just abstracted wandering off into a virtual reality kind of sense, right? So there's a sense in
Mhm,
which our entire cultural construct, to include the technology, affords us the ability to do this. And you can see
mhm,
this. I think that's part of, and I'm speaking for myself here as well now. I'm not throwing stones, but in academia generally, I tend to be more of an academic person, so I fall prey to this. It's very easy to fall in love with ideas, right?
mhm.
And forget the things that are right in front of you that maybe should be higher priority. We talked about this a little bit before we started recording. I love conversations. I love books. I love ideas, but it's been very critical for me to remind myself, and I'm by no means successful at this, that if those things are taking me away from my family and from the responsibilities that I have to love and take care of them, then it very rapidly becomes disordered. And that there's actually a way that as I've grown, especially in the past couple of years, that when that starts happening, when the thing starts getting disordered, then I can feel my whole life kind of get out of joint in
Mm,
a
mhm,
sense.
mhm, mhm.
So this idea of hierarchy that Jonathan Pajot keeps harping on is very real to me. That the most important thing has to be the most important thing. It has to be what you pay attention to the most, and
Mhm,
then everything is laid out from there.
mhm,
Like for me, if I don't spend time with God every single morning
mhm,
in meditation and prayer with my Bible open, then everything else kind of falls out of joint throughout the
mhm,
day.
mhm,
And then after that has to be my family. I have to meet the needs of my family, physically, emotionally, all of that. And then the rest of it can come down as it's appropriate. I have a very strong tendency to put my ideas, my reading, and my writing, whatever else, I get very narrowly focused and it throws everything out. Like there's a real sense in which when I try to make reality reflect what I want it to, instead of focusing on what's in front of me, we've kind of diverged a little bit from suffering and combat, but
Well, I don't,
I'll
I mean, actually, so I think there's, first of all, I resonate with this a lot. I actually have not been making many videos. I haven't been posting many things on my YouTube channel for a little while because I have intentionally been taking a step back. I also didn't have much of a choice in the sense that um, I, I no longer attempt to push back most times very hard against what I think is something like my inner daemon in the Socratic kind of sense. And so when it tells me to do something, I tend to do it. So that's more the reason. But as best I understand is why is because I was getting a little bit too much that way. And so I needed to find a little bit more clarity in my prioritization of symbols. And so I resonate with that, first of all. But to bring it around to kind of, you know, confrontation, combat, suffering, I think one of the, you don't get suffering, you don't get confrontation, you don't get combat unless you have some sort of feedback from something real that is letting you know that there's there's edges that are in contact in a way they shouldn't be, shall we say,
Mm.
between
Yeah, yeah.
what you think and what you want or what you believe to be true, and what reality is actually telling you. So, in some sense, it's almost as if you what I hear you saying is that when you're suffering, and when you've taken up responsibility and then you run into some suffering, it's because there's some shift that needs to happen, is really what it's telling you.
Within me.
Mm,
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a very good way of putting it. Um, I'm gonna start concrete and then I'm gonna work my way more abstract because I'm always tempted to start with the abstract and then I just lose myself.
yeah.
Um, yeah, what you said I think is exactly right. And there is bringing it back to if you want to draw an analogy with the person that lives, close to the poverty line and doesn't their restraints and constraints of their environment are such that they are required to do some things or else they could literally die. It's very similar with organizations that train people for combat, right? So my experience is with the U.S. military, and it's very much. I can talk about the Marine Corps particularly because it has its own kind of mythos in a strange way, but uh, there's a real sense. The thing that characterizes my experience more than anything else is that Marines love each other,
Mm,
and
mm,
I've been thinking a lot about why that is and how that is.
mm,
And I think at least part of it is the reality of combat. That's
mm.
not to say that everybody experiences combat because actually a very small fraction of people do. But within the organization, it's almost like sometimes it's explicitly spoken, sometimes not, but it's a fundamental value of the organization that at any given moment, we could be called to go to war and to go into combat with the people that are immediately next to you training right now.
Yeah.
And
It's at least
because,
imaginally present at all times.
yes, yes,
Yeah.
exactly right. And imaginally means like more than just like you think about it. Like all of our training, everything that we are doing circles around that fact.
Hmm.
And part of the reality of that fact is that if if the people that I work with are in combat with me, we could we could die if we don't do our job properly. And the guy next to me, who I talked to you a minute ago about how we get very, very tight when we fly together. If I don't do my job properly, I could get somebody else killed. And if they don't do their job properly, they could get me killed, etc. Because of that reality, there is a kind of binding to reality, to like the grounded reality. You can't, and this isn't to say that there aren't very, very academic, very, very like impressively smart people in the military because there's more than you would expect. Um, but you can come up with all sorts of fancy ideas and abstract away, but everybody just this is an organizational value. They will look at your idea and say, well, okay, how does that help the 19-year-old on the ground who has a rifle and doesn't know what's going on? Because if your idea doesn't match with reality, we're going to toss it. There's a very uh, deep pragmatism
Hmm. Hmm.
that I think prevents us from getting too far off into the stratosphere. And sometimes it happens anyway, that it's also a bureaucracy, and bureaucracy has a way of abstracting itself out of reality sometimes. But but yeah, it's interesting to reflect on, and especially at the lower levels, where that reality is more present. Um,
Well, there's
there's
something
a way that it
about,
manifests itself in the love, and that really anchors you to
yeah,
reality in a way that I think is unique.
yeah, yeah. I think, yeah, that resonates a lot. There's something that's so, no matter how far away from reality you've gone. Well, I guess I shouldn't say that. In my experience, I my favorite, not my favorite, the most meaningful part of my job is something like midwifing death to people
Mm.
is presencing to individual people the the full force of their finitude and attempting to cultivate space such that they can actually come to grips with that. And in my experience, it is in those kinds of moments that someone, even quite far abstracted out of reality, is, becomes embodied again. Um, and I've experienced that. I've like I said, that's probably the most meaningful part of my occupation or vocation, maybe. And so that's just personally, that's just in your own, like, your own body. And the people that I have that kind of experience with are people who are living peaceful lives and generally have some sort of relatively natural process bringing them to the end of their life, which is a very different kind of thing than a 19-year-old in active combat with other 19-year-olds who are in really still barely beyond the dawn of their life, and they're willingly offering to sacrifice their life for each other, with each other, to each other, for something beyond them.
Mm.
And that strikes me as several orders of magnitude uh, deeper of a almost a call for embodiment than simply than just the necessity of my life ending. That already embodies me, but the choosing of that, the choosing of that potential, and the choosing of that with others, and the responsibility to each other, and I think the word love is appropriate there in the sense that um, that's too much for me to open up right now. But I'll hand it back to you with that.
Yeah. Um, yeah, you're hitting on something there, but I also want to there is a uniqueness about war and combat. Um, but and it is somewhat different in kind, but I see it as being much more tightly related to what you're talking about in the medical field than I see more of the similarities than the contrasts. Um, I don't know too much about your own personal experience, but I would uh, I would tend to assume that people in the medical field probably have much more uh, actual experience with death
Mm,
than, speaking frankly, than most people in the military.
mm,
It's an ever present thing in a way that, like you said, imaginally it is very present with us, and unfortunately, it is also sometimes actually with us. Sometimes it's experienced, um, but it's just part of it. I view it as being a part of day to day life for a lot of people in the medical field. And again, I don't want to make assumptions about your own experience. My own little brother worked as a paramedic for a number of years, and he worked as a firefighter for a little bit too. And we had a couple of conversations about that. How about how the stuff that he saw and experienced was probably an order of magnitude above, definitely against anything that I've actually experienced. I have had the very good fortune of not being exposed directly to death in that sense. So it's all been imaginal for me. For my brother and for you, it has I would guess it is not so much the case. And that's also a voluntary thing. So there's
mm,
the aspect of it's neat that you describe it as midwifing. That's really neat because you almost it's part of your vocation then in the way you describe it to exist in that space, which is kind of frankly, I've thought of this as a caustic environment when you expose yourself to the darkness, whether that be combat or, just death in general, the making death a ever-present reality to yourself is, there are things that are good about it, but there's also things that are very dangerous about it, I think. Um, for people in vocations like that, I don't think it's the most natural, healthy way for a human being to exist.
Mm, mm,
It's necessary. And that means that people who choose that, there's something special about that. And your
mm,
job, particularly, is beautiful in that it's helping other people to work their way down to that
mm,
from whatever level abstracted away from the reality of death they currently exist in to facing that reality. That strikes me as a very challenging but beautiful thing to be
mm.
called to do, and I have a huge amount of respect for that. There's only a couple of things in my life that I never had any interest in pursuing as far as career, and medicine was one of them. uh, not so much exactly for that reason, but because I don't think I'd be able to handle it, frankly.
Yeah.
So
Well,
don't like put the military thing up on a pedestal. You've done a lot.
well, well, first of all, thank you. I appreciate that. I, yeah, I'm very grateful. It's, it's an interesting thing in the sense that a lot of our modern cultural relation to death is one of denial. Uh, and if not denial, an active sort of combative stance. And, or at least avoidance, kind of like going down levels here. But as you go down kind of these layers of our relation to death, I've had to traverse that territory so many times that it's become like a highway for me. It's territory that it, you know, both personally, every time I have a conversation with someone, which I might call um, you might call it a palliative care conversation, you might call it a goals of care conversation. There's different kind of notions for it, but it's interesting in the medical field. Very few people want to have those conversations, um, and very few people, even if they're willing to do them, very few people, I would say, really do them. Most people kind of, most other providers and doctors, not all, but certainly not all, but many of them, um, themselves would like to avoid the subject as much as possible, and thus their delivery of information becomes delivery of information. There's no midwifing. There's no there's not a space available to be held, and so that's part of the challenge in the modern world is that even those of us who are on the side of being the bearers of the news, that usually people already know, even there's not a capacity to hold space many times. We have a whole specialty of palliative care in which there's a dearth of providers available, in which that's pretty much their job, is to have those conversations with people because nobody else wants to do it. um, I personally would love it if we could get to a place where were all actually um, we all actually felt that that was meaningful enough, that that was part of why we wanted to do medicine, not part of why we didn't want to do medicine. Because for me, every time I have that conversation, it's a journey down that staircase, if you will, and back up. And so I've had to do that myself, many times. And so my perspective on death, my relationship with death, is I almost I often forget how different it is than probably what most people's uh, perspective and relationship with death is. So thank you, and I'm just trying to characterize that a little bit better. But I'd like to, I mean this, so I'd like to pivot back to kind of this because there's, I want to try to say this as carefully and as charitably and as precisely as I can. In a perfect world, we wouldn't kill each other. I'll take that as an assertion. And so I'm not arguing against military's existence or combat, or I'm not trying to make a pacifist argument, but I'm just trying to say that ideally we would not kill each other. Sadly, we live in a world where that becomes um, where that's everywhere, that's prevalent, and we, simultaneously we're in this world where we're so disembodied. But part of the argument that we're talking about, that we're making here, is that actually the combat and the training for combat and the trust that you must build with those whom you go into combat with has a sense of embeddedness and embodiment that might, as far as I can tell, it might be one of the clearest in our modern culture. It might be one of the clearest places where that still exists. But it's in fact the move towards violence, which is in some sense just the breakdown of the being humanness of cooperation that gives rise to violence. But then it's actually the violence itself that keeps us embedded as we extract away. And that
Yeah.
there's something so absurd about that, but almost like perfectly symbolical about it to me.
So yeah, that's hitting on a lot of stuff that I've been thinking about recently. There's a great analogous way to think about it. That's not just analogous. Like I think what you're saying is very, very deeply true. Um, I had the good fortune of being allowed for the past year to kind of do some research in a very very free but official capacity in my job because I've been trying to look into how to address this question because there's issues with mental health, um, not just in the military, but it's also in the military. And there's issues with stuff going on in an age when information warfare is a real thing. Cognitive warfare, I think, is a real thing. Um, and so I've had the good fortune of having some time to think about this. And in studying some of the psychology stuff, Dr. Vervaeke has been very helpful. Um, Jonathan Pageau and his brother's book have been very helpful and interesting in providing insights. And Dr. Peterson and lots of other psychology stuff. I've been thinking about how the way that our consciousness works, the way if you define your consciousness as, and this is an incomplete definition, but that aspect of consciousness as being the thing that allows you to develop an optimal grip on reality, right? So if this gives us the ability to interact with our real environment by kind of mapping itself onto reality, and Dr. Vervaeke has talked about how opponent processing is a very critical piece of that. Um, Bringing in Ian McGilchrist and the maps of meaning pieces of this. There's I've been working on this way to think about it, whereby worldview is a thing that gets constructed from the time that you're a baby, essentially, by your experiences, right? Until that you can almost think of it. And I've been working on diagrams, ways to diagram this that I think I'm hoping afford some actual helpful insights. I don't know if something like that has been done before.
Hmm.
But you can think of your worldview as like a physical thing, it's mountain shaped, interestingly enough, where it abstracts or increases in abstraction as you go up graphically. and increases in particularity as it goes down, right? So it gets closer to individual actual experiences, kind of at the bottom. If you picture like a pyramid, the base of the pyramid is like your subjective experiences that you can't directly translate to another person. And towards the top, as you move up in abstraction, you start to come up with more symbolic things like words, ways to describe in a slightly more generalized sense my experiences that now we have a way to communicate back and forth. When I say the word apple, though, like I have a specific picture in my head and maybe in recent memory of an apple that's going to be different from yours, but we both have the idea of apple that we have in common, so we can communicate. All right, so our worldview, in a sense, consists of this thing. But learning, and you said this towards the beginning, I think learning, the process of learning as such, when you have to take your worldview and apply it to reality, or something in your experience comes into contact with you that doesn't fit into your worldview and the way that you think things work, you have to allow part of it to break so that you can reform it to match your experience or to integrate your experience, right? This you can go down all sorts of rabbit holes on exactly what the nature of PTSD is, what the nature of trauma as such is. But one of the things that I have been thinking about is the sense in which that break that is necessary is, I think it is, in its most fundamental sense, a small trauma. And you want to be careful with that word because it means very different things depending on the context. But opening yourself up to that small trauma in a way that like you're holding your mental schemas with a loose hand. So it's like my conception of reality is not necessarily exactly true. Imagine that. So that when you encounter something, rather than rejecting it out of hand, or rather than trying to make other twists in your worldview to make it fit in a way that creates distortion or inconsistency, you allow it to break. And I think that it seems like that is, in the normal case of things, that comes with negative emotions. So in that sense, it is like a minor, and obviously it scales. There's like small ways that this happens that you just don't even think about, just learning as such.
Yeah.
And there's big ways that this can happen. So like in combat trauma, if you have as a part of your worldview is your basic belief that humans are basically good or that I am basically good, for example. But then in combat, I'm put into a situation where I have to do something that is objectively terrible. And I can't just choose to do nothing because something terrible is going to happen anyway, and I'm here, so I have to participate in it. So I make my decision, and I have made a decision to do something terrible. What does that do to my worldview where I believe that I'm basically a good person? If I don't have a way to integrate that experience, it has a way in which it can actually destroy my entire worldview through like a chain reaction. I think that's kind of what PTSD is. But alternatively, there's such a thing as post-traumatic growth as well. If you have a posture towards reality where you are able to easily integrate things that don't fit into your, not easily, but you're open to allowing things to be integrated, then your worldview, generally speaking, is going to be more accurately mapped onto reality. Because remember, we defined it as like this is our meaning making, reality mapper. So what is in here is actually like in a way that's more than just analogical. This is a map of reality. The more accurate it is, the more I'm open to the smaller traumas and the smaller readjustments. I would tend to think the less likely it is that one of those large traumas would destroy my worldview as such. And that's not just a mental exercise either, because cognition is extended, right? So this also has to do with the context that you exist in, your community, your family, the practices, the habits that you have. All of those things contribute to the way that you process and learn about these things. And that also, I think, my theory is understanding this also helps us to. I would hope this is going to be a leap, and I want to talk to Dr. Vervaeke about this at some point. I think learning how that process works will help us to understand how to exist in a world of misinformation, where AI is going to basically, you know, ruin our ability to know what's real and what isn't, because we learn how to recognize reality as a procedural sort of thing, and that by existing a certain way, you come to have a better map of what reality actually is, and you can discern maybe better what is misinformation or disinformation. And then on top of that, back to circle back around all the way to where we started, when you have a posture that's oriented towards reality and towards letting yourself change with those small traumas to map what you're actually experiencing in reality, that is the way that you stay grounded and embodied. I think I don't know exactly how how to describe how those are linked scientifically, but I think they are. And so it just happens naturally because of the context of, say, a military environment or a medical environment where you have to be dealing with reality. And if you don't adjust, you get fired or you get traumatized or you die or your friends die. So you're forced in that
Yeah.
sense. But it's a
Okay.
posture, right?
Yeah. Okay. So this is a lot. This is a lot, but it's really good. I mean, I like this is fantastic. And so what I would like to do is say that I mean, first of all, yeah, this is fantastic. I mean, this to me is what you're really calling it toward is a contact epistemology. That it's by
Mm-hmm.
it's you, truth is known by being in conformity to what is. It's never held, it's never had. There's an irony. The Socratic and Kierkegaardian irony underlies this worldview in order to maintain the kind of posture that you're pointing to. This kind of posture where my goal is nothing beyond proper integration and flow with reality, right? And what I would say is that as far as I can tell, so I'm going to accept everything you just said, and I will say that as far as I can tell, Christianity, big C Christianity, legitimate Christianity, is in fact the religion of cultivating this posture.
Mm.
It is the attempt to participate in a higher order religion in all the ways you can take that word, such that your actual being in the world is to reverse the fall, to become a new man, right? Because
Mm.
like the knowledge to know good and evil is to reify your worldview, to use your term. To partake of the fruit is to claim for yourself the 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 grounding of epistemology. It's to claim for yourself, for your particular understanding of the world, the ability to measure what reality actually is. And in so doing, as soon as that is done, from any point, if there's any point in my framework, I use the word construct. I think it's almost exactly the same as what you're saying with worldview.
Mm.
Um, insofar as I take a point and I claim it, which I must do in order to say that I'm actually measuring something in the world, because I have to measure it against that. Then I have made myself God, because God is that which creates what is. And so I think, yeah, I like that's phenomenal. And I think also the point where you pointed at the necessity that it has to be embodied, right? Even if you intake, like as you integrate things, you have to, it's not enough to say experience a trauma and then just, like go and talk about it with a counselor. Take it apart, make sense of it, figure out how to integrate it. But it needs to come all the way down into your life. Like you can't integrate it in one section and not another. And it has to come all the way down into your contact sense making landscape at the bottom of your pyramid.
Very much. Yeah, that was well said.
So that's a big
Yeah,
assertion about Christianity. I'm curious how that lands with you.
I would, and from a kind of a small o Orthodox Christian perspective, I would quibble with some of the ways that you define some of those Christian terms. But in a sense, like I see very much where you're coming from, and I want to affirm the part that I agree with. Like, I think what you said is true in that when we reach for the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that is, in a sense, what is happening. Um, but it's in the reaching and the grasping and in the making ourselves God or like unto God where the issue is, right? I have not nearly enough theology to be able to explicate this or to quibble intelligently with the way that you use those terms. But there's a sense in which those things we grasp for them in a way that is unhealthy because we seek control, which goes back to the idea of the fall itself, right? Um, Whereas the proper posture, I would say, is more like one of reception. It's something
Mm-hmm.
that God affords to us.
The bride of
Um,
Christ.
yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, that's like you could almost think of that as the extended cognition of the church in a sense too, if you want to put it in scientific terms.
Yeah.
But but if God is if God is a person, some other kind of person than what we are, I would put it in terms of he gives us the ability to do those things in a way that is, I think, to do with the posture. It's more helpful to use words like receive, and DC Schindler touched on this as well, right? Like it is the thing that gives us the ability to be, to exist. We
Mm-hmm.
receive that from him. It's not something that we can grasp for, even though that is our perpetual tendency to want to do, right? That's my perpetual tendency to want to grasp and to control and to understand in a way that I can categorize everything. Um, but the openness is allowing for the mysterious and allowing for real, true uncertainty to exist. And even in the ways that I make decisions, I understand that there are, necessarily the vast majority of it is not in my control. And the thing that
Mm-hmm.
I have some control over is my posture toward it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so that, in that sense, very much in agreement uh,
Yeah.
with I think what you're getting at. Does that seem like a fair characterization?
Absolutely. I mean, all the terms within anytime you start to touch the Christian framework, all the terms become, oh gosh, what do we do with them? But I would imagine that we would have it would be worthwhile to go into them, but I would be surprised if we had many difficulties with doing that. I think it would probably be very fruitful,
Mm.
as opposed to difficult. But yes, and another thing, you pointed at the AI problem, and this sort of contact epistemology is an answer to it. And I think um, I haven't really done much publicly on this yet. I'm still kind of working with it on my mind, but it's actually in this direction um, that I've been thinking because I mean I don't know whether I'm a Christian or not, but uh, I I do follow Christ, I think, and I think that this way of understanding Christianity provides an incredibly powerful answer to the AI problem and the disembodiment problem because it does emphasize a kind of humble, faithful contact epistemology.
Yeah, and I think this has been a weird transition for me too, because I also grew up in a fairly evangelical Protestant background. So that's where all my terminology and my framework and these things comes from.
Yeah.
Um, it's been especially as I get exposed to the different traditions of Christianity that exist throughout the world and the different cultures that they've grown up in. There's been a lot of small traumas, if you like, to my worldview the past couple of
Yeah,
years.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's undeniable. There's, but all that to say, I'm still trying to figure it out, I guess is what I'm getting at too. So when you identify as a seeker, I also identify myself as a seeker in that sense. There's a sense in which I feel a little bit more comfort or groundedness. I've been trying to work through how this is because I am a Christian. That is something that is a label that I freely apply to myself. Um, but that doesn't mean that I have it all figured out.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
There are some things that I hold to be true, but one of the things that I'm trying to figure out how it is true, and one thing that you and John Vervaeke and Jonathan Pageau have been helping me, I think, to figure out is the way in which Christ, he is a person, is and was a person, but at the same time, he is also a way, right? Like he even says himself, I am the way and the truth and the life, which is a
Yeah.
beautiful thing to say that we've kind of almost made trite in some
Yes.
senses. But
Yes.
there's another, if you analogize this a little bit, and I'm not like a perennial philosopher,
Hmm.
but if you compare that to Taoism
Hmm.
and how the Tao is kind of like a way, and the way that that grew up in the East, and from my tiny little bit of understanding of it, is basically through contact epistemology, like just through
Hmm.
being very observant and very open to everything that was going on around them. It just kind of emerged from their observation, if you like, um, to where they reach some actual truths, and they talk about the Tao. The translation is the way, right? Uh, I've learned from some of the people there around this little corner of the internet, if you like, when the Gospel of John was translated into Chinese for the first
Hmm.
time,
Hmm.
in the beginning was the Word, which
Hmm.
is the word logos, right, in
Hmm.
Greek. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the world with God. So, this amazing thing where the logos is a person. When it was
Hmm.
translated into Chinese, you know how
Hmm.
they translated that section? In the beginning was the Tao.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so there's almost a sense in which I look at it as like there's an emergent sense just by the context of epistemology. There's almost like a natural what's the word? I can't remember the word. Natural truth. There are things that you can learn about God from just observing creation.
Hmm.
But then
Hmm.
you also have the emanation, which is revelation, where the person
Hmm.
comes as well. Here's the key to understanding all of this. And
Hmm.
so I would say you need both from my own Christian perspective. But
Hmm.
there is a way in which it is a way, in addition to just a person or just a collection of propositions. And I don't know what that means completely yet, but if that is what you are seeking that way, then there is a sense in which you are seeking Christ. And so maybe you could consider yourself, the question of whether metaphysically that is also a person is probably the part that small Orthodox Christians would emphasize. But
Yeah.
what do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot to say there. Let me see if I can that what I will say is I'll take all of that, and I think it resonates. I think there's enough other things in other ones of my videos where I've talked around some of these things that I won't go through too much of it right now. I'll try to just condense and say that for me, the incarnation of that which is, and I'm happy to use any of these terms, the Tao, logos, being, I'm happy to use these terms. The incarnation and then the crucifixion and resurrection as a historical event, as a symbolic manifestation, as a binding together of reality, and as a redemption of fallen reality, strikes me as particularly coherent, particularly beautiful, particularly redemptive, particularly loving, and particularly good with a capital G. And that is why I say I follow Christ. I follow Jesus. There's so many things to unpack in all of that, but I hold a very kind of ironical, in a Socratic sense, ironic relationship with Christianity. Um, Mostly because, as I referred to my daemon before, that is the space available to me at this time.
Mm.
Um, and I'm I'm willing to sacrifice whatever to be where I am meant to be. So I've kind of surrendered a need for certain aspects of life that appeal to others maybe more, but um, there are also times where I really wish that like going to that Orthodox church at the end of the conference weekend last weekend.
Mm.
Like it's beautiful, and the symbolism and the participation and all of those things. Like it's really lovely. Um, there's an aspect of me that would just be overjoyed to just participate in that, but for now it's foreclosed to me. So that's just my personal bit. But does that answer
Yeah,
your
you have to.
question?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's I, and this is a struggle that I've had to get over because growing up as an evangelical is like what evangelization means is like you are telling people the story of the gospel,
Yeah.
and I can bear witness to how it's changed my life, which I think is a slightly more effective thing that some people don't emphasize as much. But I have to let go. Like I can't try to, you know, even if I believe that that is the best thing
Mhm.
for a person that I care about, I cannot force anybody to do anything or to believe anything or to embody anything. And what that means to me is I have to be willing to let space, to hold space, maybe. I don't, this is a new term to me, but it seems appropriate to hold space for somebody to process on their own because you have experiences and unfortunately it is a truth that there's a lot of people who have very negative experiences with churches and with
Yeah.
Christians, and that's something that you can't just unsee or unexperience the things that you've experienced.
Yeah.
And so I have, full empathy and understanding for your position. And it's what I would totally affirm that the fact that you are seeking honestly, and it strikes me just in my brief experiences in talking with you, that you are seeking honestly and humbly. And if you are doing that, that's how you find the truth. Like I have some things that I believe about where the path to truth ultimately leads, but if I try to my understanding of that is so incredibly limited that if I try to claim that I know it in a way that I can tell it to you and you can just accept it, that would be incredibly arrogant of me to try to do. And it tends to destroy relationships pretty
Mm-hmm.
quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope that's landing in the way that I'm hoping it is. But I trust that you will absolutely find the truth, whatever it is, with the kind of posture that you seem to be taking. And I totally affirm and understand the position that you are in, if that makes sense.
It does, and I appreciate that. I thank you, Cory. I'm very grateful to have met you. Um, there's as with as with many folks at the conference, but I really experienced it with you particularly, there's a sense of sincerity um, that resonates a great deal with the sort of posture around which I've oriented my life. And I'm I'm really grateful for your care. I'm really grateful for your sense of openness and your sense of desire to do what part may be available for you. And so um, I appreciate you, and I'm really grateful that I got to meet you and that we got to chat some more. I hope to do this again. There's certainly a lot more to uh, in some sense we may have jumped around a little bit from path to path in this conversation, but in many ways we've only opened more doors in doing so. So thank you, Cory.
Thank you, Ken. That's incredibly kind and affirming of you to say. Um, yeah, I feel very seen, and I am also very glad to have met you, and I'm glad that we met in the context that we did of minor combat. That was actually really, really fun. The paintball for Jesus, it cracks me up.
Yeah.
But I agree with everything that you just said. I hope we get to talk a lot more. I learn a lot from listening to you and from listening to all of the cool people that we got to meet this weekend and people on YouTube. I find it very gratifying. We did jump around a lot. I'm a very I like to jump from idea to idea, so sometimes it's a little incoherent, but it felt like a genuine Dialogos. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, because I definitely did.
Oh, absolutely. And hey, that's how it goes. There was definitely a through line as far as I could tell. So thank
I
you,
think so.
Cory.
Thank you, Ken. I hope we can do it again soon.